For so many of the small businesses, they are still struggling throughout the pandemic. There has been some hope and some lifelines, but as we continue to navigate through the COVID-19 crisis, their struggles are not over just yet. To talk a little bit more about the survival of so many of these small businesses, let's bring in Brian Calley. He's the president for the Small Business Association of Michigan. It has been a tough year.
It really has, and it's really just stretching out to be, about a year and a half or year and several months now that certain industries are really still struggling substantially. We have seen some good signs in the overall labor statistics and rehiring that's happening. Actually, it's kind of a tight labor market at the moment in a lot of different industries, but restaurants and bars and any type of business that revolves around bringing people together still struggling a lot in this recovery. In a lot of ways, their recovery is only just now starting, whereas manufacturing and in construction, a lot of lines of businesses, their recovery really started last summer. So I think it's important that we keep in mind these top line economic statistics are headed in the right direction. But underneath that, when you get into the layers of it, there are some industries and those industries that tend to be dominated by smaller businesses are the ones struggling the most.
I mean, and we see the headlines. We know the headlines where it's relief is coming. And for some of the businesses, they are able to take advantage of some of these grants that are being offered to them. But when you think about this, like the music venues that are still closed, or so many of the restaurants that are still operating at reduced capacity and limited hours, while they're able to reopen the doors, it's not business as usual. So for some of them that maybe even the ones, there's some, it's been hard to get the money that's become available through these grants because the need has been so great. And for others, that money runs out pretty quickly. Because if you're talking about 20, 40, 50,000, but we're over a year into this pandemic, it can be hard to stretch those resources. Are there any other programs in the pipeline?
The reason that we always, whenever we talk about this, about relief programs, we like to start with the fact that there is no substitute for being allowed to be open. Right? So that's the top line message. Given the fact, though, that so many businesses have been either directly closed by government orders or, as a practical matter, closed by government orders, there are some relief programs that have been effective in the past and a few new ones that are just coming out now. So a few I'd like to highlight through the Small Business Administration, the United States Small Business Administration, the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. They put out the SBA put out the rules and the guidelines on that just this past week. And I think that'll be big for restaurants. Go to sba.gov if you're a restaurant, food truck, or a bar, or anybody whose food and drink is the main line of business. This is going to be relevant to you, and it's probably going to be more important even than the Paycheck Protection Program. And then there's the Shuttered Venues Grant for those performance venues that have either directly or because of the limitations and the size of gatherings, as a practical matter, been closed for more than a year. Those two, I think, are going to be particularly important for those industries. And while there's been a lot of noise, a lot of things going on out there, if you're in those two industries, I would say that this is something that you ought to drop everything else and pay attention to, because they're bigger in many ways, many cases. I think it's going to be more important to those industries than the Paycheck Protection Program.
So for some of the businesses that are frustrated because maybe they weren't able to get through to try to get help in some of the other programs, this could be their opportunity.
Yeah, sometimes the other programs, when you build a program and you try to structure it so that it works for everybody, but businesses are so different one from another that when you structure it a certain way, even if you do a good job at making sure that it helps most businesses, you still have many that for the intricacies of the construction of the program, it just didn't work very well for. I think shuttered venues, performance venues, are a good example of that. They're not labor heavy, but they're capital intensive and very expensive to maintain and hold. And so the Paycheck Protection Program really didn't do much for them. So I think the Shuttered Venues Grant is going to matter a lot for them. And for restaurants, of course, they've been under either closure or restricted capacity orders for over a year, and so rebuilding that business, getting back to business, and then even when you're operating, it's much more expensive to operate under today's rules as compared to normal times. Um, so I think that's going to be really important that the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, and I'm worried that it's going to run out too. There'll be a rush on it, and the need is great in that industry, and so I don't have good sense for whether or not they appropriated enough money for it until it opens. We really won't know, but I think that it's going to be a key component to the recovery of that industry.
We're talking with Brian Calley. He's the president for the Small Business Association of Michigan. One of the sad things, though, is we are hearing of restaurants that are having to close down because they simply cannot find enough employees.
Yeah, this is starting to pop up across a lot of different industries. And restaurants, because they were restricted for so long, many of their regular employees had to go find other opportunities. And so they're just not available anymore. And then on top of that, you have the unemployment insurance rule changes that have allowed for much longer stays on unemployment. So I know that a lot of employers are feeling like, boy, it's one thing to compete with other employees or other employers to get employees, but now I've got to compete with the government to get my employees back. And so that's what I think it is important that the mindset around the way that public policy is managed for unemployment, the unemployment safety net, that has to change. At a time now when there is massive demand for people, we really do have to encourage people to get back into the workforce as opposed to waiting on the sidelines, especially this far in, and especially when we know that there's a huge demand growing for people.
And with that, Brian, we know some people are saying, pay them more, entice them to come back. But you drive up and down the roadway, you'll see every fast food restaurant is hiring with signs, bonus, sign-on bonus, come work here. Starbucks, which is one of the, better, food outlets to work for, because I think they offer insurance at, I don't know if it's 24 hours a week or 32 hours a week, but they offer insurance. But they're even struggling right now, having to reduce those hours. And it's like you said, because even if you get employees back, especially those that worked on tips, they're not making the tips that they once made. So they're weighing, do I want to come back to that industry? Then when you had the governor recently say, don't eat indoors at a restaurant, well, she didn't make it, a mandate. It was a recommendation. It continues this cycle, which for small business owners can just really be the death of their company. You put all of these things together.
I had a member just last week that was sharing with me her hiring efforts on a brewery, and offering $16 an hour now, and health insurance benefits, 401k, paid time off, just a really attractive package, and is having a hard time to even getting people to apply. And so I think what people are sometimes thinking is that, hey, unemployment, right now with the federal and the state benefit together, it's about $600 a week, or it could be close to $700 actually a week. And so it's not that you just have to beat $600 or $700. It's that you have to beat that per week. You have to beat that by a lot in order to make it, because if you're going to pay $1,000 a week, then to the person who's making that decision, do I go back to work now or not? Then really the differential is only $350. So it's like, do I want to go back to work full time? And the difference is only $350. So I think that's where I think the public policymakers are kind of missing the ball here, is that it's not just the idea that you got to beat the unemployment system, and the unemployment system is paying as much as a lot of these jobs used to pay or more before, but you've got to be way, way over that in order to entice people to come back.
And so with that right now too, we are hearing so much about the vaccine passports, as they're calling them. The Dodgers announced today that they're going to allow fans back into what they're calling a vaccinated section. So you have to prove that you've been vaccinated, then they'll allow you to sit in one section. You still have to wear a mask. Do you anticipate that's going to continue as more and more states open up?
Well, at the moment, businesses are free to set the policies that they want and whatever their customers are demanding, and that goes for their employees and for people that are coming onto their property. We've had a lot of discussion among our members, and while we haven't formalized a position yet, there's a process for that regarding vaccine passports and a whole host of issues around vaccines. I can tell, though, that business owners, by and large, do not want to be in the middle of mandating or in the middle of enforcing mandates on vaccines. But we also think that it's important for them to maintain the autonomy to make the decisions of what's best for their business. So on the one hand, I don't expect, certainly most small businesses, to police or ask for whether or not somebody has been vaccinated. I also think it would be problematic for the government to essentially tell all businesses, here's what your vaccine policy has to be. That is something that ought to remain in the purview of that business owner.
Yeah, what a tough time to be a business owner, because, we even saw this discussion at the beginning of the pandemic when it came to COVID-19 testing and the rules around HIPAA. When do you share who, was exposed to COVID? If you have a small team or a large team, were they exposed to one individual or not, but you can't give out that individual's name? And can you require someone to have a negative COVID test to come back to work? There are so many things that just make it such a struggle for so many of these business owners, especially small business owners right now.
It is not just understanding what the law says, but it's also just the way that you operate your relationship with your employees and with your customers. People don't want to get in other people's business, and that's in terms of their private affairs. And are you going to get your vaccine or not? And a lot of people are proud of it, and they put it right out there. That's great. But the idea of expecting a business owner to be the vaccine police on their customers and employees, regardless of whether or not that's legal, it's just a bad idea, because these are individuals that have so much on their plate already. It's obviously a very controversial issue, and maybe it shouldn't be, but it is. And so the idea that you would expect that that person that's already kind of struggling to survive and win their customers back, and say on top of that, hey, the government's going to ask you to be the vaccine police, it's just not going to work.
It didn't even work to ask people coming into your establishment their name and their contact info. So, it's just a crazy world that we live in right now. And speaking of that, if we can jump topics just a little bit here, I know that some business leaders here in the state of Michigan recently came out together in a stand of solidarity to talk about, some of the issues around voting, and really urging our elected leaders not to make it more difficult for people to vote. And we've seen the backlash of what happened in Georgia. Is there room for politics and business?
Well, certainly there's engagement by business in politics. For our part, our members have been very adamant. You stick to business issues. And so if it's regulation or taxes, in this case, it's getting very much into public health issues that impact business operations. That's all within the purview of the sorts of things that we get involved in. I think that my members would probably fire me if I used our bandwidth advocacy on things like what should the voting laws be. As long as we've got members that are closed down, members that are still very restricted, I think there's a determination that we need to keep our focus on creating an environment of success around small business owners and entrepreneurs, whether they're starting up or they've been in business for a long time or they're looking to pass the business on to another generation. That giving the best shot for our communities in the future is creating an environment of success around the ones who are already here, the ones that have already put their time and their treasure and their reputation into this enterprise. So for our part, I expect that we will stay focused on those business issues, and some of the other players might get involved in a lot of other issues outside of business, but that won't be for us.
And with that, we do know that, so many businesses, they are big political donors to so many of these elected leaders. But you also wonder, is this really the time to be taking on voting issues when we're still in the middle of the pandemic? We are still struggling to get people back into the offices. How many more businesses are going to continue to close? Will we even see our downtown areas get back to where they once were? That should be the focus right now.
I think that's it's a really important point that it's, I talked earlier about industries, but it's also regions and then neighborhoods inside of regions, downtown areas in particular, those that have a high reliance on office worker traffic. Every business in those areas is struggling. And it could really change, and not just change the business districts in those areas, but also the local governments themselves. Their tax bases, whether it be income tax or property tax, are substantially eroded. I mean, think about trying to build a budget and look out a few years for the city of Detroit or the city of Lansing or the city of Grand Rapids. There's 22 or 23 cities that operate on an income tax. If they lose their office workers for another year or maybe forever, then it's really going to have a massive impact on those cities' ability to deliver the types of services that their citizens are used to. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of really important reasons to stay focused on business issues right now and make sure that we build the strongest possible economy. And you're not going to have a strong top level economy unless you've got a strong base of small businesses and successful entrepreneurs underneath it.
Brian Calley with us here on the MegaCast. He's the president for the Small Business Association of Michigan. Just another minute or two here with you on this show. It breaks your heart because every time you drive down the street, you notice another small business that has closed its doors. And they really do make up the backbone of our local communities and the uniqueness of them. But we're more than a year into this. And in the beginning, everyone really rallied behind so many of these businesses. But more than a year into it, can we keep that, enthusiasm to support these businesses going for much longer?
We have to, and I think that we have to recognize too that a lot of the changes in the ways that that government dealt with the pandemic, whether you agree with them or not, they favored bigger businesses. They favored companies that are not headquartered in Michigan. And so I think that we have to have the discipline to reorient ourselves back toward local, thinking local. So we have local big businesses, we have local small businesses, but thinking local and supporting local, I think is going to make a big difference between how we recover from this pandemic.
Brian, anything maybe I didn't touch on that you want to add before we say goodbye today?
Well, I think that we covered it pretty well. The thing I'll just add is to put in a plug for the two top things I think you can do to support small business. First is buy local. Second is get your vaccine. The sooner that we get this pandemic behind us, the sooner that we can get back to business under normal circumstances. And I think entrepreneurs are going to do really well once the uncertainty of this pandemic is lifted.
Because it has definitely taught all of us to be stronger.
It certainly has. Thanks so much. It's been great to be with you.